Welcome to Push to Be More, the podcast with me, your host, Matt Edmundson. Although it's fair to say that I'm not going to be your host much longer. In fact, this is my swan song. I've been sacked, ladies and gentlemen. No, that's not quite true at all. But today's podcast is a little bit different. I'm sat with the show's producer, Sadaf, who is on screen. And we're going to talk about some of the changes which is coming to the podcast, why those changes are happening, and what other notes you've got on your your computer there to tell me what we need to talk about. So if you've been a regular to the show, you will know this podcast is all about how we get a hold of leaders and people and ask them what they do to, push to be and more is the title of the show. Like what challenges, I always like this sort of conversation around challenges, like what challenges have you had to face that you've sort of overcome. To be was always about what does that look like? How do you fill your tank? Or how do you recharge your batteries? Or, sort of phrases like that. Like what is being? What does that look like for you? And then more is all about growth. What does the next 5 years look like and how are you going to get there kind of thing. And so we never really had a structure or a structured series of questions to the podcast. It was always like, we were going to ask questions around those three pillars and to see where the conversation took us, really. And we've been doing Push now for a couple of years.
I want to say almost 3.
3, 4? I don't know. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It has been a while. And I've enjoyed pretty much every episode. I'm trying to think if there's... I can look back over like EP, the e-commerce podcast, which is the other show that I do. I can look back at that and I can go, well, there were some guests that weren't as good, as we were learning on the job. But I think with Push, I can't think of anybody which I didn't enjoy talking to. I think predominantly because it got quite personal quite quickly. Whereas with e-commerce podcast, it's all about, it's all about like the education aspect of it. And so sometimes that's good. Sometimes people can be a bit salesy. Sometimes people run out of things to say. But when it's your personal story, I think it's different. And so I've thoroughly enjoyed every single episode. So if you've been on the show, thank you for coming on and being a guest. It's been great. And I've really enjoyed talking with you, really enjoyed getting to know you and the stories, and made some really good friends as a result of doing this podcast. Had some really interesting opportunities as a result of this podcast. But like all good things, they must change and adapt and evolve and pivot. And the paradigm must be different. Aligned. The paradigm needs to be aligned better. So we need to pivot to,
make sure we get all the business lingo in there.
Yeah. All the words that I just hate. The word I hate the most, by the way, is ping.
Ping?
Yeah, ping me an email. I'm just like, I just want to ping you in the face. I'm really sorry. I just want to ping you and ping you. You can't see what I'm doing if you're listening to the show, but I'm just kind of like flicking my fingers. Yeah. And so anyway, this is not a show about business language that Matt detests. But it is time to think things through and have a bit of a different direction, a different way of doing things. Because I think our business needs from the podcast have changed. What we're doing has changed. And I also think the people that we have on the podcast, I think that's probably going to change. So there's a whole lot of things which are going to change, basically. And we're going to talk through what they are and why we're doing them. Is that right? Have I got that right?
I think so.
Yeah? You've got the notes on the computer.
Well, it went off.
There you go. Oh, that was an interesting noise. Okay. So what's your first question?
Okay. So, Matt, tell us why you...
Remember, get close to the microphone. Yeah. Every single time. If you don't know... I get too
comfortable when I'm hanging out on the podcast with you.
On Push to Be More. It's true to say that you and I have co-hosted a podcast called Pod Junction.
Yes. For
a little while together. We've done like 60 or 70 episodes. And so we're quite used to this conversation. I mean, I don't know if we've ever done a Push podcast from the studio here.
Yeah, the one you did with me.
The one I did with you was here?
Yeah.
Okay. Was that Push or was that What's the Story?
Both.
Was it? Oh, well remembered me. So I've completely lost my train of thought. What was I talking about?
You're probably going to say something about me and my inability to use a mic.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say. So we have this show. I say we had this show because I made the jest about being fired at the start. I was definitely fired from Pod Junction. So you've kicked me off that show. So we don't co-host it anymore. So it's like, mate, you're just too boring. We're gonna end that whole thing. But every single episode, without a doubt, I would say to you, microphone. Yeah. You have this aversion just being near the microphone. I don't know what it is.
I forget that it's there.
Big bright metal thing in front of your face. How can you?
I don't know.
I can see this thing.
You know what? It only happens when I'm in person, not when I'm recording on.
Like if
on
you're
Riverside.
doing if you're doing like an interview with somebody online, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, then
I can figure that bit out. It's just this when I'm in
the co-host.
Yeah.
It's because I think it's because you move a lot more.
Yeah.
You're a lot more animated.
Yes, that's probably true.
Yeah, it's probably true. Anyway, now we've got the microphone. What was the question?
So, tell me. I know you've just said that what you enjoyed about Push to Be More. Mm-hmm. Tell us what you learned from it.
What did I learn from it? Here's the interesting thing about that podcast. It was the first podcast we did that didn't talk about a business topic, right? So with e-commerce podcast, we talked obviously about e-commerce. With Pod Junction, we talk about we used to talk about podcasts. Mm-hmm. You do it all now. I don't talk anymore. I'm still sore and bitter. It's fine. But do you know what I mean? There was a topic to talk about. Mm-hmm. With Push, there wasn't a topic. The topic was the person that was in front of me. And it was. It took me a while to realize this, actually, that the podcast itself was deeply, deeply personal. Mm-hmm. I mean, deeply personal. I remember Chris George, I think it was, who came on the show. He said to me at the end of the first time, because he'd been on e-commerce podcast, and I said, George, you'd be great. Chris, you'd be great to come on to the Push show. He's like, sure, man, let's do it. And we talked, and he said to me at the end of the podcast, it's something that's always sort of stuck with me. He said, Matt, how is it I told you more things about my life in the first 30 minutes than I have some of my closest friends? Now, you've got to bear in mind that if I go with you to the pub, right, which is very British, or at least it was, we don't tend to do it anymore, go to a coffee shop and spend an inordinate amount of money on coffee. The topic that we talk about and what we talk about is good. But if I've not met you before, right, and we go grab a coffee or we go grab a beer, then we're going to talk about football. I might talk about my family, might talk a little bit about the business. Do you know what I mean? It's all very guarded conversation because I don't know you. And if we got together in the pub for the first time, and the first question I ask you is, so if you could have anybody on a podcast, who would it be and why? They just need to have had a really big impact on your life. You're going to go, will you just get away from me, you
Who are
lunatic?
you?
Yeah, you're just going to think you're nuts, right? Especially when I follow up with the question, so what's the biggest challenge you've had in life that you've had to push through? Those two questions are not questions you ask the first time you meet somebody, right? They're just not. And so when you think about those questions and the vulnerability that is required to answer them, it becomes this really extraordinary idea because, like I say, you just wouldn't do it in the pub. But if I do it on a podcast, for whatever reason, that seems totally fine and totally reasonable to go and ask those questions. And every time I ask them, and my favorite question by far is always if you had a podcast question. And so if this is the first time you're listening to the Push podcast, by the way, you're very warm welcome to you. But I tend to start off every episode because we're a podcast business, by saying, listen, this show is sponsored by Pod Junction, or Aurea Media as it used to be called in the early days. And we're a podcast agency, right? So I was very interested in that if you did have your own podcast and you could have a guest on, anybody from your past or your present, the only caveat being that they've had to have had a big impact on your life, who would be your guest and why? We've had people open up about long lost relationships with their dads, people like Tony Robbins, Jesus was quite popular, as was, well, not popular. We had one answer with Dolly Parton.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, apart from the fact that instantly surprised me, it just led to the most wonderful conversation, right? Because I'm like, well, why? What is it about? Because I'm nosy, right? What is it about Dolly? And so I'm asking these really deep personal questions, and I'm getting answers straight away, and I'm asking why, and nobody is batting an eyelid. No one's going, just leave me alone and stop asking me these really awkward questions, you weirdo. Do you know what I mean? Which is the response I would get at the pub. And so I think, coming back to your question, it's a really long answer to your question, but the thing that has surprised me about it, the thing that I've enjoyed most about it, are the same thing, and that is how easy it is with the preface of a podcast to actually get people to be instantly vulnerable about their lives. And that always, always, always makes a much more interesting conversation and a much more interesting podcast. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. I think it's really, you're right. I don't know whether it's that you've committed to this time of being, of chatting. So it's in the diary, you're online, you're ready to go, and you're ready to just answer anything, whatever comes at you.
That's right.
It's a different mindset almost, as opposed to, as you were saying, like
it is
for a beer.
It is. And especially when you do it with business leaders, right? So in the context of a podcast with a business leader, again, the same principle applies. I can ask, it feels like just about any question about their business, and they will happily answer and have a conversation. Whereas again, if I was the first time I met you and asked you those questions in like a networking event, you'd be like, just back off, dude. Don't get so intense so quickly. But in the podcast arena, it's perfectly fine. And so what you find then as a result of that is it accelerates a relationship. And so you not with everybody, you don't instantly form like a really good friendship with everybody. I wouldn't claim to do that. And in fact, actually, some people after the podcast can withdraw. Yeah. This is this really interesting idea that a friend of mine told me about, because I was talking to him about it, and he said to me, a pastor friend of mine, he said, actually, when people are raw and vulnerable and divulge details, it's not always a good thing, because they understand that you know more about them than most people do. And as a result, they can withdraw from you. And so he said, he's lost friends because of what they've told him, but then get uncomfortable with the fact that they've been that vulnerable and raw with him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think when you have that kind of vulnerability on the show, people, not everybody, but some people do, and they don't really want anything to do with you, not because of you, but just because of the way that whole thing was like, I'm just not comfortable post-show actually sharing what I shared. That said, we've never had anybody come back to us and say, please don't put the episode out.
Yeah, that is true, yeah.
We've had people come back and say, do you mind cutting this section out? And we're like, sure, man, of course. But never really don't put the episode up. But what I have found is actually, because of the depth and the vulnerability in the conversation that we have, then I've become very good friends with a lot of those people. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does.
And I really, really like that. When we started the show out, I got people on the show who were friends. And one or two of those, actually, our friendship has evolved and got deeper, if that makes sense. As a result of it, which I think has been super helpful. A lot of business relationships, which is good, that's come out of it. And so, I think that's been fantastic, and that I really treasure that, and I think that's been wonderful in so many ways.
Yeah, I like what you said, that it was separate from business, and these conversations were, even though you were talking to business leaders, you were networking with them, but the conversations weren't necessarily to do with your own business. Yeah. That's quite refreshing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I didn't want to do just another leadership podcast. I didn't want to do another podcast where it's like, well, tell us your top 10 tips for leading. It's just like this. There's a lot of those out there, and actually they do that a lot better than me. Yeah. And I didn't want to do a podcast that was around expertise. So if I did a leadership podcast, that's about expertise. And I didn't want to do another expertise podcast. We do a podcast called What's the Story, which is similar to Be Push. And I really enjoyed the digging into people's stories and finding out what makes them tick. And so to have the opportunity to do that for as long as I have has been marvelous.
So
we
have now decided to, do you want to say it or should I say it?
No, you go, yeah. I refuse.
Okay. No, we're going to change things a little bit. So as you were saying about you're digging into people's stories, and that's been really interesting and fun, and like personal growth, I'm sure probably has come from some of those conversations as well, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's something with conversations that grow is what we are wanting to dig into a little bit more. So we're focusing on, so even your first question to your guest was?
Well, hang on. Conversations that grow. You need to explain that.
Okay, can we cut this bit out? Can you ask the question to me then? Let's do it that way.
Josh, let's not cut this bit out.
Josh, cut it out. Cut it out. How does it go?
Cut it out.
Yeah.
Cut it out. Okay.
I was slaughtering someone there, I think.
Yeah, Josh, definitely don't cut this out. And if you're listening to the audio, go check out the YouTube video.
Okay, Matt, you ask me then.
Well, I'll ask you about it, but you need to make some kind of bridge because I think I finished talking.
Yeah.
And so just make some kind of comment like, oh, okay, so, well, now that's great, but now obviously there's some changes coming afoot. Or we're pivoting.
I don't know what the last thing you said was, but...
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
I can't remember.
Okay. Josh will know.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for that, Matt. No, that's great, Matt. Thank you. So we are making some changes.
Yes, we are. I like the use of the word we in this. So yeah, there are going to be some changes coming up in the podcast. And we'll tell you what the changes are. But shall we talk about why we're making the changes?
Yeah.
Would that help? Clarify maybe?
Yeah, let's do that.
So this all came out of our conversation around Pod Junction. And so we were co-hosting Pod Junction, which is a podcast about podcasting, very meta. We should call it the Meta Podcast. Don't miss that one. And Pod Junction has changed over the last few months. You've taken much more of a leadership role in that. And you quite rightly pointed out that actually the way we were doing Pod Junction didn't align with the people that we were trying to serve, which pains me to say is actually quite a true statement. And so it needed to pivot to a different paradigm. Yes, I am making the inverted comments with my fingers if you're listening to the audio. But it was quite right. Pod Junction needed to change. We'd experimented with it and we felt like, right, actually to really get this to where we need to serve people, we do need to make some changes, right? And so we were like, well, actually, that's a fair question. Do we then need to change this podcast, Push? Because Push was always was part of, in effect, Pod Junction, wasn't it? To network, to connect with people, CEOs, business leaders, meet them, share stories, and so on and so forth, which was always good. But did we want to change that? And did we want to take this opportunity? Now we understand what Pod Junction is a lot more, because that has changed quite a bit. Do we want to reevaluate? And as much as I love doing Push, and I do, there's only so many hours in the day. Only so many hours you have, only so many hours the production team has. And so I didn't want Push just to be a passion project. I wanted Push to be very much a case of this is something that needs to make sense for the business. It can't be a big cost to the business from an opportunity point of view. And so I think all of those things together, we were like, well, let's rethink it. And so that's what we did. And it's, well, first of all, Pod Junction, Push to be more. get the right podcast. Push to Be More is changing its name to
Conversations That Grow.
And the host is changing from Edmundson to
Sadaf Beynon.
So you have taken over yet another one of my podcasts.
I have. Overmap.
And so I just have e-commerce podcast left. And so at some point you're going to come for that one, aren't you? But no, I mean, jesting aside. Yeah. So they're two big changes. I mean, a name change and a brand change is what it is. Why Conversations That Grow?
Okay. So you've touched on the branding and the name. Yes, that's changing. But the heart of the podcast is still going to be the same. So, sorry, what was your question? I don't know if I'm going.
Why the name change?
Okay, the name change. The name change is to reflect the podcasting element of what we do. So we believe that with conversations that we have, that Matt had on Push to Be More, that we have outside of the studio, they can really be quite influential in how they shape us and the direction that we end up taking in our lives. And not every conversation, but there will be some, and everyone's got those. Maybe one, maybe two, maybe 20, whatever it is. And the point of the name change was to reflect that, and to also then to talk about how the power that conversations have. So not just what's happened historically, the conversations that we've had, but what we can do moving forward.
Yeah.
So how can we influence our businesses with conversation? What does that look like? Or how can we build influence with conversation?
So hence the name Conversations That Grow. Conversations that grow us, that grow our business, that grow each. Do you know what I mean? It's just like conversations that lead to growth.
Yes.
It's just a bit too wordy. But in effect, it's what it's going to be, isn't it? So the format of the show is going to stay the same.
Yes.
Is that right? Yes. So if I came onto your podcast, are you still going to ask me the podcast question?
No, actually, I am not. Just not that one. My first question is going to be...
Oh, I've not heard this.
No, you haven't.
Okay, come on, drum roll.
This might be the one and only question because it depends on where it goes.
Yeah.
But what's one conversation that you've had that's changed the direction of your life?
Oh, I see. That's a brilliant question.
And then just see where that goes.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Because actually what that does, and what I found with Push is that question, which I think is really good. I genuinely do. I think it's really good. It's going to create a space for the guest to decide what they want to talk about, right? And what they feel comfortable talking about, and how deep and how vulnerable they want to go. And so when you're doing the pre-calls with I assume you're still going to do pre-calls. So when you share that question and you're like, I don't want to know the answer. No, if you're like me, I don't want to know the answer until the show. I want to be able to respond live. It's like, you obviously, that can be any conversation that you've had, and you go as, feel free to go as deep as you would like.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. Because I love it. Yeah, I think that's great. So how would you answer that question?
Oh, wow. I don't know. I have to think about it. There's so many conversations. I think some big, some small.
Yeah. And I think so that means it's definitely a question that you need to give to the guest beforehand.
Yeah, which I do in the pre-call,
Yeah, and because I think you'd want to have time to think about it and think about what answer you want to give. Okay, so that's the question you're going to start off with, and then the show's just going to go from there.
That might be the question
and where you go from there, and just talk about whatever.
So it can be a business conversation, it can be a personal one, it can be a blend of the two, which we often found
with
Push, didn't we? Yeah. So it's not completely changing.
Love that. And why are you hosting it rather than me? Because that'd be a big question people have got in their heads.
Why am I hosting it instead of Matt?
This is your opportunity to say, because I'm a much better podcast host. What's wrong with you?
I'm not sure right now.
That's what I would have said.
Because Matt thinks I'm hosting it because I am also, because going back to what we're saying about Pod Junction, we're connecting the two more so than we did with Push.
Yeah.
And so it makes more sense to have the same person.
Yeah.
The one contact person rather than
than
one touch point,
the one face with that. And actually that I think that will work quite well. I think, it'll put you in touch with people that you will be working with in Push and with Podjunction, and I think it'll be great. And I'm excited for it. I genuinely am. I think I'm hoping it will give it. The thing with Push was always it was always the last podcast on the list, wasn't it? In some respects, because we had e-commerce podcasts, we had Podjunction, and then sometimes we'd have guests for Push, sometimes we wouldn't. And we're like, we should probably go get some guests. And the thing that I'm looking forward to is actually it not being an afterthought, but being like prime center to actually what you're trying to do. Because I think conversations that grow tie very much in with the what's the word I'm looking for? The theology of Podjunction.
Yeah.
So the systems, the way you use podcasting to grow your business, you're in effect using conversations that grow to model how to do that for Podjunction clients as much as anything, right? As well as having great conversations, it's going to be a great sort of teaching thing, isn't it? And learning thing. And I think that in itself is great. And I think that was a big part of the reason why I thought you should probably do that. And so, I think it's going to be fascinating to see the sort of the second phase of Push to Be More. We've pushed, we've been.
Now we're more.
Now you're more. And it's as simple as that. So, so I think that it'll be interesting, like I say, to see how this comes out. And obviously, I wish you all the best with it.
Thank you.
And if you're listening to the show or watching the show, make sure you stay subscribed, because I think actually it's just going to go up another level. And I think the conversations will be better. I do. And I think it's going to be really quite interesting. And of course, if you'd like to come onto the show and share your story, just get in touch with Sadaf. I would say at pushtobemore.com. You can probably still use that web URL, but what's the new one?
Conversationsthatgrow.com.
Did we get the .com, did we?
We did, yeah.
Fantastic. Conversationsatgrow.com. You can also find it there. So don't be surprised if the podcast artwork and branding and name changes in your podcast playing. You're like, what's this Conversations That Grow? I didn't subscribe to this. So you're probably going to have to put a little note on the start of every episode, aren't you? Going, this is the new name for Push to Be More. And I am the new name for
Push to Be More.
Formerly hosted by Matt, who is now unemployed. So, yes. It's funny, Andrew Hartshorn, who was on the podcast recently, and he talks a lot about building a business. He says, you either build a lifestyle business or you build a business to sell it. That's his big thing. And he and I talk a lot because we're both into acquisitions. And he was like, one of the big litmus tests, he's put this on LinkedIn a lot, if you follow him on LinkedIn, is if you didn't turn up to your business for 6 months, would it survive without you? And I'm like, I don't even know if I'm going to be allowed back in the next 6 months.
They changed the keys and the locks.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening here, isn't it? Which is, I actually think it's a wonderful thing, but that's just me. So make sure you stay subscribed to the show. Let us know what you think. Hopefully this has sort of cleared up what's happening and why. But any questions, obviously get in touch, let us know. And you can reach me on LinkedIn. Just go search Matt Edmundson. You're on LinkedIn?
I am. Sadaf Beynon.
Yeah. We'll put the links to both of those in the show notes. I say that. I don't know if we will. I'm sure you will.
We will.
But come follow us. Come say your questions. It'd be great to hear from you. But thanks for being with me all this time. Genuinely loved it. And I dare say, am I coming back onto Conversations That Grow?
Of course you are.
Am I going to be allowed? I'll do all the ad reading. This podcast is sponsored by. So hopefully I'll be back. I might do the odd one here and there. Special guest appearance.
Yeah.
Blast
from the past.
A blast that probably should stay in the past is probably more correct. But genuinely loved it and really appreciate it. Appreciate you guys listening and staying connected with what's going on. And I look forward to the next chapter. So, that's it from me. I'm signing off from Push to Be More. God bless you. Bye for now. And from you?
Bye for now.